Welcome and good evening. I want to say I'm your man Steve Harvey, but this is not Family Feud. But this is real talk, engaging trauma and resilience with the Impact Movement. It's been a long time, audience, and it's good to be with you again. I hope you're doing well. Tonight we have an interesting conversation. Um, some of the topic has been familiar with us for the last few years. We're almost maybe a year out of the pandemic. Um, all the restrictions are passed. People are still getting COVID, but there are still a lot of issues and trauma plaguing our society. So tonight we're going to talk about engaging trauma and resilience. I want to introduce to you our panel. They are all over the country right now with joining us. So up top, you may see Renee Begay. She's in Albuquerque. She represents the Zuni people. She's a beautiful sister from New Mexico. Then over to the right, not too far from New Mexico, is TJ Poon. She's in Austin, Texas. Everything's big in Texas. And then down at Williamsburg, Virginia, is Rebecca Wheeler Waston. She's here. Don't wave, what Rebecca? Go say wave. There you go. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, right in the city of brotherly love, is in Philadelphia. Is Michael Chen. How you doing, Michael? There you go. There you go. Well, I'm gonna give a little history and the context for this conversation because this is very important for us. Um, a few years ago, actually, geez, I think it was no, it was August of 2016. I was introduced to the Allender Center, which is a center that focuses on helping people engage story of trauma. And there I met Dan Allender. And from that conversation, uh, we were introduced to sexual trauma. But as everyone knows, we have been engaged in racial trauma for a while, not just with Black people, but AAPI, Native, Latinos. It's just rampant and consistent. And from the conversation, um, Dan came back to me and he says, I want to engage this a little bit further. Do you have any recommendations for me? And at that point, I wanted to see how interested he was to expanding and deepening his understanding of racial trauma. And I made a recommendation of for him to do three things because I was coming back to Seattle in just a few weeks to see if he had time to do this. And that was to see a picture book, to read one book, and to watch a movie. And then from there, a relationship happened between the Impact Movement. And I'm Jimmy McGee. I'm the CEO, president of the Impact Movement and the Allender Center. Cross pollination of facilitators and our staff going through story workshop. We've done a couple of events. One, the very first one was called Race, Trauma, and the Gospel that happened before the pandemic. And so right now, the Impact Movement is going to host an event um, called Hope and Anchor, September 28th. And we'll give you more information about that later on. But I think for us as a panel, all of these guys here have gone deep into being trained to facilitate trauma. Uh, some have degrees in pastoral care and PhDs. They've been certificated in trauma, and then they're also astute to their own communities. And so, what I like to do, I'm going to ask a couple of questions and just share it around. And let me start with you, Michael, because I think this would be important. Can you just explain what is trauma? Can you just give us the definition to start off? What is
Yeah,
trauma?
thanks, Jimmy. I mean, I think it's so important just to try to define what we're talking about. I think trauma is such a buzzword now. I've got two kids, ages 11, 13, two boys that are on YouTube, that are on TikTok, and they're sort of getting a lot of this filtered through social media. So they're telling me that they're triggered, which obviously is related to trauma, but when we're talking about trauma, I think we're talking about events that have been so overwhelming to us as people, so impacting us even on the cellular level, or at the level of our nervous systems, where we're having bodily reactions of fight, flight, freeze, and all of those responses, those trauma responses to past events, are very much related to our story. And so we're going to talk about our stories a lot tonight. But, just to say that, yeah, there are traumatic events like natural disasters, the things that I think we're most interested in as people who have been in ministry for years and years, might be categorized as complex trauma. So complex trauma, meaning that there's deep relational complications, family of origin issues that entail maybe chronic abuse or neglect. And we're really trying to tend to and care for the impact of complex trauma.
So let me ask you another question to follow up, and Rebecca, I'm going to ask this to you. Let me ask you: is trauma discriminatory? Does trauma discriminate? Is there any population that is excused, or it's like a land of Switzerland that people are not traumatized, whether you're rich or white? Is there any space where people are not trauma or experience trauma? That's for you, Rebecca.
Oh, no. That's the thing about trauma, right? I think it is a function of being human in a world that is full of struggle. Um, Sometimes as Christians, we talk about it in terms of being a fallen world, but I think all of us, no matter how old we are, no matter our gender, no matter our ethnicity, our nationality, whatever the pieces of our puzzle are that come together and make up our stories, none of us are immune to places of struggle, right? I think Michael gave a definition of trauma that talks about events, that can talk about things that feel catastrophic. But sometimes trauma can just be an incident, right? A sentence that is said, a word that is spoken, an action that is taken in a matter of minutes that actually overwhelms the basic support structures that we have in place. And when we have that feeling of the support that I have is not enough to withstand what's coming at me, now now I'm struggling to make a meaning of and to absorb and to metabolize what is actually happening to me. It could be something as common as a car accident. If you've ever had that sort of sense of like being in a car accident and you don't exactly remember all of the details. You moments after the accident, I don't remember all of the details, right? But I do have this sense of something happened that I can't quite make sense of. I don't have memory of it. I don't have vocabulary words to explain it. Um, and even that can just be a sense of something that feels traumatic. And so you might have been in a car accident on a particular street, on a bridge, in a particular neighborhood. And years later, every time you go through that neighborhood, every time you drive over that bridge, you feel yourself tense a little bit. When really that feeling of being tense when you're back in that same neighborhood, back on that same street, can be your body telling you it still has some unprocessed, unresolved energy around that incident. And I think what we're hoping to talk about, tonight and some of the programming that Impact is getting into is how do we actually deal with those moments, and how do we deal with them in a way that I can maybe learn to go through that neighborhood and not be so tense, past that bridge and not sort of freeze.
Um, I'm gonna go to Renee. Wait 1 second, because I got a special question for you. But TJ, let me ask you this question about shame. We often, I know I've been in rooms where people want to compare trauma, and some people feel like my trauma, well, that's not something that I want to speak about because it's not as traumatic as someone else. How would you encourage people to escape the sense of comparison and this idea of shame that my trauma is not as horrific as someone else?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that's really common. We can be very dismissive of our own stories, of what we have suffered, what we have gone through. And I think, as Michael mentioned, trauma becoming a buzzword kind of is both helpful and unhelpful, because if in your mind, trauma has to be something that you have not experienced, something big, whatever that is in your head, then it can cause you to be very dismissive of your pain. But I would say that we've all been harmed in some ways. For people of faith, like we believe we've been made by God, but then we also see how we've been marked by our surroundings, by our families of origin, the things that we've walked through. One of the things that the Allender Center focuses on is comparing our story to what we were meant for. Like when we think of the glory that we were meant for, when we think of the love and connection and all the things that we were meant to receive from our families, from God, from our communities on earth. And then when we really engage what we were meant for, it becomes a lot clearer that we have been marked in some unhelpful ways. And, Rebecca brought those things to light. They can be what feels big to us. They can feel, small. But those aren't really helpful words, big or small. What is more helpful is to just be honest about the places where we have been harmed, and that we get to seek healing for those things, even if in our past we've been dismissive of them.
The part I wanted to get to you, Renee, that I find that I connect with you so often on is the idea of using story as a vehicle to engage our trauma. And I think we, as Native and African American, certainly me, mixed blood, this idea that our oral history and these stories are vital to life. And when we talk about trauma, what people are not picking up on, trauma is not necessarily what's happening right now, but it's definitely connected to something that occurred previously. So tell us how valuable story is to unpacking and engaging trauma.
Yeah. So first, this is necessary. I need to introduce myself, which is connected to story. So Kelly Hot Renee Begay let you know. So I said, hello, my name is Renee Begay, and I belong to the Sandhill Crane clan. I am a child of the Eagle clan, from the Pueblo of Zuni. Rebecca, Michael, TJ, Jimmy, and I are just want to welcome everyone who's watching, and just to join the conversation, and just think about the story weekend that we're going to be hosting in September. But even just the act of introducing myself is connected to my story. There's a quote that I like to mention from Indigenous author Thomas Keane, where he says, the truth about stories is that's all we are. So like we're made up of stories. There's things about us. We're made up of those things. Stories of who we are is connected to stories of our parents, of our people, of the land. So the rest of creation is connected to that. And so I think it's, just even important to acknowledge all those themes, that we are made up of all those themes. And sometimes I guess like it's hard to go back to the past because we've been conditioned to think, or we've been told always like, oh, that's just in the past, like keep moving forward in the future. But it actually, it doesn't feel that way when we experience who we are. I feel like we have to acknowledge what has come before us, and I've always quoted you, Jimmy, of like, you can't impart what you don't possess. The extent to which we're willing to learn more about ourselves and our stories, our backgrounds, even though it's painful, I know that we have to be very sensitive to how much we go back, but even to the sensitivity of like how much we want to, we need to know those things in order to be able to talk about the hard stuff in the future going forward, or even just being present right now with who we are and what we're experiencing.
That's true. Faulkner even said the past is not dead. It's not even the past. It's this idea that it continues to revolve in us. You said that too, Michael, as well. Michael, so when we talk about trauma, some of the things that were spoken was like a car accident, but oftentimes trauma is associated by harm that one human being has done to another human being. It can be racial, it can be familial, it could be a stranger, right? In either way, um, who who are the victims of trauma? Is it just the victim itself that's dehumanized? Can you explain or unpack that just a little bit more for us?
No, I think what I hear you saying is actually there's a whole system involved in trauma, and stories get played out over and over again. Um, and again, I just want to be clear, like what I hear you saying, that there's something about perpetrators, those
Yeah.
perpetrating trauma that actually are carrying so much hurt and trauma, that that it continues to hurt, and damage, a whole ecosystem of relationships. And so, yeah, certainly, there has been a lot of attention, in literature and research on PTSD about the symptoms of trauma, and maybe we could talk a little bit more about that later tonight. But I think what you're referring to is that there's a deeply relational break, um, that causes the trauma, but also that is retained, um, and which makes, I think, healing, and healing initiatives so powerful, not just for victims but for perpetrators as well.
Yeah, so I mean, most of us are familiar with this book that's maybe 15, 20 years old that I think is highly connected. Is that hurt people hurt people, traumatized people create trauma as well. And these are realities that we need to talk about. So as we move
Yeah.
on, first I want to say, you want to say something, Michael?
Oh, yes. One more thing. I think this is
Yeah.
why, what's happening here in our midst, and this initiative, Hope and Anchor, as we think about future leaders, that the impact, of unresolved trauma, unaddressed trauma, particularly when you step into places of power and leadership, has such a huge, widespread impact, for those who aren't willing to bear the cost of their own trauma and their own healing. It's very costly, again, for marginalized folks, for people of color, historically. I think, there is a thought like this country was birthed out of trauma, for people coming into, um, indigenous lands, bearing a lot of trauma in their bodies, and then, uh, continuing that cycle. So, um, just to say, as we talk about, Hope and Anchor in some of these initiatives, really trying to, address the issues of leadership.
Yeah. See, this is exactly why when I got introduced to the Alamo Center Story Workshop, this was a skill I think our staff needed and that we needed to impart to our students. That discipleship is not simply just helping people with the reconciliation of the cross with their sins, but is understanding what it means to walk through this life as freed people who worship God. And you can't be free if you don't address necessarily the trauma that we have. And it's both universal, but it's also specific. But this whole experience, though, really honest, it's not just a weekend where we're just going to talk about trauma. So it's not just only about trauma. We got the term is really engaging trauma and resilience. It's hope and anchor. So I want to do a couple of things here. I want to go back, Renee, to you, because we spent some time with the Pueblo people and the Zuni tribe in May.
Mhm.
And one of the things that you were very intent about was talking about resilience in that experience. Can you unpack that, why that was so important for you to share that for us? And then, Rebecca, I got a question for you and followed by TJ.
Yeah, I mean, it's connected to my pursuing interest. You know, trauma wasn't something that I was like pursuing, you know, from the beginning. It was just something that came up as I was meeting with students. I saw things that were happening that I didn't have a definition for. And so as I started pursuing this interest of like what's happening, what's going on, started learning more about trauma. And it's hard to hold that topic because we're very familiar with it as Indigenous peoples, our history, broken treaties, boarding school survivors, missing and murdered Indigenous women and children, and men and our relatives. So it's just this like continuation of all the things that we're experiencing from colonization. And so, but the trickiness or the hardship that is in addition to that is when we've encountered the church where we were seen as a deficit, that some of these things were our fault, like maybe alcoholism or all these things. And so like it's almost like these things were our fault. Or even some people still think like, well, if Indigenous communities want to change, they'll do it themselves. Like they just have to like will themselves to do it. But it's just like, no, it's much deeper than that. And so even just holding these stories of trauma, and they're real, like they're very real in our communities. There's also this voice inside of us, I think connecting to the stories of what makes up who we are, that we've been here for centuries. And so as a people, so what are the things that are keeping us alive? Was the thing for me that was like fighting back or resisting that, you know, accept all the trauma and like figure out how to heal it. But in the healing, there was this like question or this curiosity of like, well, what has kept us alive? And what are the things that have helped us to thrive all these centuries? And so that was the thing that I wanted to balance with the experience of hosting people to come to Albuquerque and experiencing, you know, the land and our history here. I was passionate about highlighting we've been here for a long time, and let's go look at why, and what are the practices of resilience that we've been engaged in. And it's going to be ever changing, because I still feel like resilience is something that is connected to trauma. Sometimes I feel like my body's saying like, well, it's not just connected to trauma. It's like who we are. It's part of our creation stories. It's part of like who Creator made us to be. And so even with that, like there's still something within us that's like keeping us alive and helps to live, love, and, you know, thrive in the environment that we're in. So
see, that caused us as a cohort to come alive in that experience. Now,
yeah.
Rebecca, now you live in Williamsburg, and I think it was 2 years ago. No, it was earlier than that. The 1619 project occurred. It was on the New York Times. There's a book which is a collection of particular chapters written by a variety of people. I want to talk, or I want you to unpack why resilience is so important for you in this process. And then I'm coming to you, TJ, about hope.
So I think of resilience in two ways. Like the first way in terms of just individually as a person, right? As a Christian who believes that I was knit together in my mother's womb, right? And for me, this notion of what does that mean to say that the God who created us knit us together in the womb, a God who is all knowing, right, and can look ahead and make provision and see in advance from your life, from the beginning of a few cells all the way to the end of your life and everything in between. And this sense that resiliency as an individual can really be this notion of like a God given capacity to survive, to thrive, to overcome, to live, right? To love, to not be overwhelmed in the ultimate sense by the obstacles and the struggles and the harm that comes our way, but this capacity to overcome. Um, Scripture very clearly says that greater is he that who resides in me than he who lives in the world. And so for me, resiliency is that sense, that spirit, that capacity, that power granted by the God who created us to overcome the obstacles that will be put in our way by an enemy that is real, and that seeks to oppose us, and that is smart and intentional in the way that that opposition comes, such that something that would be oppositional to me might not be oppositional to TJ or Michael or Renee, but it would be for me, and vice versa. The other way I think about resiliency, if you sort of pan the camera back from my individual life and you try to locate me in the people group to which God inserted me. And for me, that is African hyphen American. And that hyphen, it means something, right? In that Michael said earlier about that there are some people groups that don't exist but for trauma, that this country was born into trauma. And so I think as an African American, that hyphenated existence is only alive and there because of the transatlantic slave trade. Like literally, I come from a group of people that does not exist but for um, this collective, catastrophic, all shifting, all altering trauma called the transatlantic slave trade. And so you mentioned the 1619 book and the project, and I live about a mile from where the first slave ship uh, arrived on U.S. soil. And if you go to the museum there, they use the word arrived, which I take great exception to. Um, and so there's a book, a children's book that came out of the 1619 project called Born on the Water. And one of the things that the author suggests in this book is there was a people that is forged, born, created in the water of the transatlantic slave trade. And that people group is African American. And so when I think about what might have happened on that water, when you think about hundreds of tribes, hundreds of people that represent different tribes being shoved onto this slave ship, and somehow months later when they arrive on US soil, they're a different people group. What happened on that water and what was sown into them by God that allowed us as a people group to still be here 2, 3, 400 years later, still loving, still living, still surviving, still thriving. Whatever that is resilience. Sometimes I have vocabulary for that, and sometimes I don't.
So as our audience can see, we're an eclectic group, and if we're having some trouble tonight on Facebook Live, so I'm trying to direct people to to our YouTube channel, which it is going live right now. If you have questions and you're watching us on YouTube, please post those questions, and we have people behind the scenes who are going to relate those questions to us. But I do have a question for us. For TJ, as people look in our audience, we're Native, we're Asian, we're Black, and of course, if it's not obvious to everybody, you're white. And I really want to talk about the value and importance for you not just being on this panel, but why people should select to participate in this experience. Because oftentimes the idea was, well, we don't have ethnic food. This is not really our story. Do we belong in this space? And actually, sometimes we give the impression we don't want white people in the room. But I just finished reading King of Life, the most recent biography on Dr. King. And before that, I read the most recent biography of Malcolm X. And the idea was, at the end of their days, they actually met each other at the same point of why it was valuable to have white people in the room. Can you explain personally and then encourage others the hope of why white people should participate in this experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I can talk about that. I am fond of saying that white people can be saved, but they need to be discipled into the kingdom. And what I mean by that is it's one thing to profess faith, to believe in Jesus, but to actually adopt the way that Jesus moved on the earth is to be willing to divest yourself of privilege, of these different things. I'm currently getting a master's degree in spiritual formation, and I'm drawn to that because I really want to know like how communities are formed, how we get formed together. And I think about people who have been racialized as white in the States in this day and age, like we've been spiritually formed in supremacy. And those things have given our souls a particular shape, whether we wanted them to or not, you know, whether we felt like a willing participant, we have been in many ways. And so being able to see those things, to begin to have some curiosity about how they were formed and actually some grief about how they were formed and the impact that that has had on other people. I think that, you know, the history of my people, I have German and Dutch and Scottish origins. And so for me, I like to introduce myself not as beautifully as Renee, but I talk about my ethnic origins because people who look like me are rarely asked to give an account for themselves ethnically or culturally. And part of that is, you know, exchanging this community, exchanging practices and culture in order to take on this label of whiteness, to blend in, to have a, you know, this privilege of assimilating because we look like this. But the cost of that for us and primarily for others, honestly, has been this shaping in supremacy. So actually, I think all white folks have to do like their own belonging work, we have so many questions about our belonging. And when we haven't answered them for ourselves, we kind of spew that mess everywhere. And so it's been so important for me to do my own belonging work and also to really lean into my belovedness as a child of God. And that, you know, is sometimes difficult when I also want to faithfully engage the reality of how people in bodies that look like me have moved on this earth, including myself. You know, Rebecca was talking about the ships that carried enslaved people, and people who looked like me were sailing those ships. And just that kind of being cut off from humanity. There's so much trauma, as Michael talked about, for folks who look like me. So I would say, like, come to learn. Randy Woodley says that white folks get to be junior partners in the work. And I think that's such an honoring statement. Like there's a decentering that has to happen for us, but we actually do get to participate in talking to our own people, in working towards some of the beauty that God has planned for us and for our communities.
So I have a follow-up for you because
Okay.
the country is polarized. We are seeing incredible amounts of policy that is being passed both on school boards and even in state legislatures around education and this fear of history, as you just said, because I think we've already stated pretty much that trauma is a reference point of our past that affects us presently. And I'm curious to you, you're encouraging them to come, but in the midst of all of this propaganda and this polarization, what would you say in the midst of this, of why it's important as a Christian white woman of Dutch German descent and Scottish, why it's important for them to not put this moment off and to engage it now?
I think there are so many reasons. I think about the urgency of the moment, like what you described that's happening in education. I don't know all the reasons that this is happening, the reasons that people who look like me are so afraid of the history or being really honest about it. I can't say that I know all the reasons why that's true. I think that I can acknowledge that it is painful to look at the ways in which we've participated in systems of harm, and that there's some kind of connection actually to what we're trying to do in story work. There's a part of us that would love to distance ourselves from any pain that we've experienced, and we want to keep it at arm's length. But actually the way of transformation is to be willing to bring that pain close and to listen to what it's trying to tell us. And I think, for Christians who are supposed to care about the impact on their brothers and sisters, I would say that our brothers and sisters are in a lot of pain. And a lot of it is because we have not dealt with our stuff. We are holding our own pain at arm's length. And that means that we're just propagating it, like Michael talked about earlier. And so it's actually a moment of courage and integrity to invite that pain closer, to being willing to look at it, and hopefully to heal and to be part of healing on this earth.
Again, I want to tell everyone, if they transition from Facebook to YouTube, to please, if you have a question, post it over there. And our folks in behind the scenes, they're going to tell us this question so we can ask the panel. Now, we've been talking a little bit philosophically and we've been talking personally. Let's turn the corner a little bit, Michael, and give us a little description of what does a story workshop over a weekend. At least give me one portion of it, and I go to everyone, someone else afterwards, of what they can expect this event is about.
No, I think it's a great question. One of the things that we know about trauma is that it actually takes offline the meaning-making parts of our brains. Certainly, a lot of the physical impact of trauma, insomnia, GI issues, autoimmune disorders. I mean, there's a lot of highly correlated physical symptoms that we come to bear in our bodies. But one of the reasons why we continue to try to really press into stories, and particularly stories from childhood, is the fact that in trauma, the meaning-making parts of our brain actually go offline. And so to create a space in which, a healing space that's safe, where people can actually bring, with honesty, with truthfulness, with candor, maybe sometimes things that they've never told anyone. For there to be a grounded, non-anxious presence, this is where shame comes to die. And that's our hope, that we've cultivated enough capacity in ourselves to be present to someone else's suffering, someone else's harm, to be able to offer to them a tender presence, a strong presence, and in that, really trying to model what it is for God to be present to us, for God to be with us, even in the darkness.
That's good.
So some of the things that we actually invite people to do is to write stories, and to have them engaged in groups, to hear some teaching, to hear some sharing about the ways in which, I think churches, ministries, leadership can be more trauma informed, but also what it really, I think, is we're trying to get at, how do we experience hope? There's only so much we can learn from books and ideas and philosophy, which I love, but I've been so captivated and transformed by the experience, the lived experience of hope within a community, that with starting to live with a people robustly and honestly, that I think that has brought a great deal of transformation. And so that really is our hope, to really embody. And so you've talked about orthopathy, I think, Jimmy.
Yes.
In being to hold, as people of faith, deep emotion, and for that to lead us to different places in our lives, the places where I think where God might be calling us. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, that's exactly where we need to go. I want to give credit what's due. I use the term orthopathy often, but I got it from my sister, Margaret Yu. So she gave it to me. I use it, but I give her credit. Now, I do want to let you know, as if you're watching, we lost TJ for a moment and she came back. That is not going to happen in our weekend. We're not going to kick white people off and then bring them back. We want you to be with us for the whole experience. Okay. Now, we do have a question. Somebody wants to give us a question from our YouTube. Can you hand it to me? Oh, here we go. This is Charles Burbank, former student of mine. Truth and identity seem to be key ingredients in healthy dealing with trauma. However, today people tend to choose the truth that they would accept. How can we deal with this as it creates more trauma? Did I say that? How can we deal with this as it creates more trauma? Rebecca, go ahead and answer that. You're an attorney. That seems like it's legal and psychological. We need all the help we can deal with.
Well, I appreciate the question, Charles. And as a mother of two teenagers, I certainly am more aware than I'd like to be of the sense of choosing truth that we want to accept. But one of the things that I appreciate about this work and the way in which we do it is that we will ask you to participate over the weekend with a small group, 5 to 6 people that you will journey together with over the course of the weekend. And the reason why group becomes important is that we are not wounded in isolation, and therefore we will not heal in isolation. That we need other people to bear witness to our stories, to our choices, to our thought patterns, to our behaviors, so that the group, the community amongst us can help us actually see not the truth we choose, but the truth that is, right? And often what happens in trauma is that as Michael said, our executive functioning goes offline, and we lose vocabulary, and we lose memory, and we lose the ability to make meaning of what actually happens. And often it is the people who are bearing witness to this that help us bring all those things back online. Again, I'll use like a really sort of oversimplified example, but I have two kids, and my daughter, when she was younger, um, was using an escalator in a mall, and she fell and got hurt. My whole mom heart was like in absolute panic because my child got hurt on this escalator. And if it were up to me, I would have been like, never again for the rest of forever are you going anywhere near an escalator, right? Like we're taking the elevator or right, we're doing something else.
Mm.
Her father, like within seconds, right, of sort of picking her up and dusting her off, said, come on, we're getting back on this escalator. And he made her go up and down that escalator probably 6 times before we left the mall, right? But what that did then is it shifted the meaning of this event for this little child that could have walked away from this with a fear of escalators that could have grown over time. And you can imagine you meet somebody as an adult in their 20s or 30s that, I don't do elevators. I don't like these things that we don't do because of something that happened when we were smaller. But by him sort of bearing witness to that and saying, you're okay, you're fine, I'm going to dust you off and we're going to walk this together until you feel comfortable and you're more aware of your strength and your capacity, right? Then she got a chance to relearn and reimagine a different ending and walk away stronger and capable of facing escalators that life was going to throw her way often. And so that would be the sense of my answer to your question, that what we hope in your small groups is that same sort of role that my husband played with my daughter, which is that the small group can bear witness to what happened, right? And remind us of our own resiliency and our own capacity in the middle of difficulty, that can be honest with us about what's true in the situation, even when, as TJ said, it's hard for us to be honest with ourselves.
So during the course of the event, we're going to be separated into small groups. I think the term was 5 to 7 people. So there are facilitators assigned to these spaces. They're not necessarily LPCs, but they've been in this before. Renee, can you just explain what the role of the facilitator is like, or even when you went through it, what it felt like, the role of the how the role of the facilitator helped you in your experience?
What I experienced when I went through the training was I experienced facilitators who created the space for me to be able to be my most authentic self. And so I feel like I appreciated that. And I would say that that's what I would like to do also. The hard part with like facilitating a group is that we talk about safety. And sometimes safety is different for everybody. It's really hard to find what is safe for everyone. And so I'm careful with that word of safety. And we've had conversations of like, what's an alternative, to describe what we're trying to do as facilitators. I like to think of it as like creating or facilitating a space that that is respectful of each other's stories, but then holds each other's stories as sacred, sacred to who we are and the things that we're moving towards to like make meaning of our lives. Like what does it feel like to our ways of knowing and being, but then also the history that we carry, to be able to hold all those things sacred. Because I feel like safety is real hard to get to for every single person. It's very different for each individual. So I would like to say that as a facilitator, I'll do my best to, hold your stories in a sacred way, to be able to facilitate a space where you feel like you can be authentic or move into the authenticness of who you are. So I don't know if I missed anything else. If you guys have anything else to add.
Does anyone else want to add to this idea of what the facilitator does? I think she did a great job, but someone else want to add, or because I have a question for TJ. No, okay. Again, audience, if you have questions, please type them into YouTube. We'll be glad to answer them. TJ, let me get the dates right. September 28th through, am I right? Or no, September 29th to October 1st. Is that right?
That is correct.
September 29th to August 1st. What we're trying in the way that you guys are working through the curriculum. Let's divulge to them. We begin with the end in mind. So the idea of us recruiting people to participate in this, what's some of our outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Desired outcomes, I mean.
Yeah. Well, I think, earlier I was talking about sometimes our desire to hold pain at arm's length as a campus minister. So I've been on staff with Epic Movement. I have to give Epic Movement a shout out for 16 years. And most of my spiritual formation has happened in that Asian American context. And, we walk with students, we walk with other people, we hear their stories. And so many times, like, those stories are difficult. We hear painful stories. And I would say that our capacity to be present to those stories, to actually hear them and listen and be able to engage them, is in direct correlation to our capacity to engage our own stories, to draw those places close. I think about, the other things that everyone on the screen has talked about and the ways that we do that. Those are all, what we're hoping to be able to facilitate happening in this weekend. Each of you, if you come, will be asked to write a story. And we talked about, the kind of the process of engaging that in a group, how deeply healing it is to have someone witness your story. The power of a non-anxious presence. I think Michael used that term. Like, there's a way in which the Spirit is there, moving in this group that's really powerful. And so I would say that, those individual outcomes of being able to engage your own story, for those of you and those of us who work with other people, to be able to apply that. Like, every weekend that I've ever done, I've immediately applied what I've learned to basically all of my relationships. I have 2 kids. They just walked through the house. Y'all didn't see them because I made them go on the other side of the computer. But deeply changes the way that I engage with them, with my spouse. So I would say that those are some of our outcomes. I think maybe other people could add some things.
Go ahead. I'm going to let someone. We do have a question, though, that needs to be posted. So can we see this question now? Oh, here we go. Kayla Rogers. I know her, too. For people in our lives who need to address their trauma but don't want to open up old wounds, what can we share to help them see that programs like this are more helpful than harmful? Excellent question, Michael. You want to give a shot at it?
I think it's such a good question. I think one of the barriers that we face, I'd say maybe even particularly in church or ministry spaces, is this need to have everything put together. And to not have struggle, and to be fine, and to have a happy face. When the reality, if we were to sit with one another long enough, certainly there would be just a long list of broken relationships, of anxiety, of depression, of you name it. Relational complications, betrayal, loss. So what would be actually more harmful is that you would not address those things. And then not addressing your harm, as we mentioned, that would continue to spill out and wreak havoc on your relationships at work, in family. So to actually not do this work is actually to cause more harm.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Michael, as I listen to you, I think in one way I would look at this seminar is a way to help people become stronger evangelists. Oftentimes in church, we've been in those spaces where people will say,
Yes.
well, how are you doing? Oh, I'm highly blessed and favored. Now, we know by looking at their face that they're lying, but we let them pass on that because we're so quick with these quaint, quick colloquialisms that it's really a way to push people away.
Yeah.
And then we also give the impression people don't want to be around church because those are the people who got their lives together. And that's really not the case. Actually, as my friend once told me years ago, the church is nothing but a collection of crooked sticks that God can draw straight lines with. And what we don't know is that when we show that crooked healing, that we give people opportunity to say you're welcome into this space because we're all on a journey of having ourselves straightened out in a way that's more glorifying to God's intent of our own humanity. And so I would definitely encourage people to do that because we need that type of authenticity today. I think that's what we're experiencing. People are shamed in saying that they're hurt, that they received trauma, and this is a space that we can give them practice to being authentic back into places of faith in the worlds that they live in, both where they reside, where they work, the churches where they worship. All those things can come out of this. Let's get another question. We got another one coming up.
Before we do that, can I answer a little bit about the outcome?
Yes.
So I do think, I mean, the one thing that TJ mentioned is a written story, right? And if that sends like panic through your chest, the thought of writing or the thought of writing about something that you probably have been told for a very long time are things we don't speak of, right? I will say that it never ceases to surprise me what actually comes to the surface when I take a few minutes to try to find vocabulary for something that has happened in front of me, in proximity to me, or directly to me that I want some care about. And so that the request to write something, was done with some intentionality about what we will tell on ourselves actually in our own stories, because we will lose the capacity to edit out the things that are socially unacceptable or inappropriate to comment on. And so I want to say that. And then for me, one of the things that is a really really significant outcome to me personally is the idea of like a really solid biblical frame around trauma and resilience. And I say that for me personally because as someone who believes in God, right, but whose life has been full of lots of harmful scenarios, I have always struggled with the sort of question of how could a good God allow bad things to happen? And in that struggle, right, has put my faith in various seasons on shaky ground because I didn't have good answers for how to move through that question. I knew I felt it in my body, in my heart, in my gut as a question that didn't have an answer. And doing this work has actually helped me to build a frame around how you engage a very real question, like how does a good God allow not just bad, but like ugly, awful, horrific, unspeakable, unthinkable, relentless, perpetual harm and hurt to happen to a person that I love or care about, whether that's me or someone close to me. So I think part of our hope is that you would leave this weekend with the beginnings of a frame, like the way you fill in a puzzle, that maybe we'll have a few edges defined around what that frame might look like. And we can't promise like a full puzzle that's totally put together, but we can start together to sort of put some of those pieces in place so that a frame starts to come into focus.
Let's look at this question, because this is an interesting question for you, the team that is working on this. I think it was from Cindy Messner. Here it is. All are invited. Would the small groups be mixed race groups, white and people of color? This is in regard to the question of safety that Renee introduced to us. I don't know who to pick on this one. Can I get a hand? Come on now, put your foot in the water.
I mean, I'll say this, and I will start this on behalf of the team, and then everybody will jump in. But I think, to be honest with you, at this moment, my answer is we don't know yet, right? And really, the question brings up something that we can struggle with. What happens to me, a Black American female, when I am in proximity to someone who does not look like me? What happens to me when I'm next to TJ with all her blonde hair and blue-eyedness? What happens when I'm next to Michael with his face, or Renee with her face, or really Jimmy with his face, right? And how safe do I feel when I'm in proximity to another person, right? And I think we hope and we want and we desire a world where we could all be in a group together and it is well with each of us, more than well. Like I'm a better version of myself because TJ and Michael and Renee are in the room. But we all know that's not our lived experience. And so I think our back to the issue of safe enough, right? And yes, part of what we want in this room is safety. And for some people, safety will mean the more people that look like me in my group, the safer I will feel. And for some people, that doesn't invite safety. And I also want to introduce one more thing, which is this idea of not just a safe space, but a brave space. And I think this weekend we'll ask that. We will ask that of each other, all of us, including the five of us on the screen, not just the participants, right? We will aim for and wrestle for and fight for safety, but we will also ask of each other to be brave, right? And to risk what it is to be in a group in proximity with someone who for whatever reason does not invite for you an immediate feeling of safety. So practically, we don't know because we haven't seen your stories yet, right? And we will ask you to write a story and send it in early, and we will labor in prayer and in effort over each of those stories and prayerfully place people in groups.
Okay.
And some may be homogeneous and some won't. And we're going to ask you to trust us and trust the process and trust Jesus, that if your group is all BIPOC, that's what you were meant for those 3 days. And if your group is mixed ethnically or mixed along gender lines or any other mix that gets thrown in there, that's what you're meant for.
You know, it's going to be an eclectic group of people drawn to this experience. So what I like to do now is give each of you the opportunity. I'm going to start with Renee, then TJ, Michael, then Rebecca, and then I got a closing statement. I want to want you to make your pitch of why someone should consider being here for this weekend? Starting with you, Renee.
I already shared your quote.
Oh, you did?
You can't impart what you don't possess. I really do feel that. I mean, I talked about how I didn't have definitions for what trauma was, or even like the mechanisms behind it or things like that. But and it was mostly because I was experiencing it through interactions that I was having with students. But what I realized was that, oh, I have trauma also. And it took me to have to like be vulnerable with myself to acknowledge those things, to be able to be like to live into the authenticity of my identity, and spiritual, ethnic, or indigenous identity. But even just having the willingness to do that, it's hard, but being able to do that has really helped me to see others also, and to hold other people's stories with respect, and gentleness, and I think the word acknowledgement comes to mind. I think when there is a wound, even the wound wants to be acknowledged. So just even acknowledging those things really helps. So I hope you do consider, whoever's listening, to join us for the weekend. Yeah, and if the part about the groups and how the makeup of the small groups will be, I think we want to just even be able to create that openness to acknowledge those feelings that come up from being placed in a group that you probably hope that you like didn't, it didn't turn out the way that you wanted it to. But yeah.
Okay. TJ?
Yeah, I would say that we talk about the past shaping us without really thinking too deeply sometimes about what that means. But when I think about that, I think that, what we've experienced actually gives a form, shape, and texture to our reactions to things. And healing comes with choice and agency and imagination, this ability to look at some of the ways that I react to things, and to look at those things that I don't love, and actually be able to change that. And so for me, healing is space to consider something different, space to feel free, as Jimmy said, to embrace my belovedness, and to be able to pause and look at the way that I want to react, and to actually choose something different. And that the beginning of all of that is coming to some honesty about the ways in which I have been shaped.
Okay. Michael?
The word presence keeps coming to mind for me, even as I think about impact as a ministry, trying to ground this trauma work in a biblical lens. I think about the biblical story in terms of presence, and even from the beginning, although God walks with his people, he does not dwell with them. And the movement in the biblical story, the unfolding movement of God in the tabernacle, in the wilderness, to the building of the temple in Jerusalem, to convey a sense of his presence. And then the end of the story is this undeniable beauty in being present with. And so that's what I really believe what we're doing, is growing our capacity to be present with one another in a way that starts to reflect the goodness and the glory of God, and to call that out, to witness that in one another. Okay. I think that's something holy, something unique and special.
And Rebecca?
Oh, she's muted. Sorry, Rebecca.
That's why.
Sorry. Do you think after 2 years on Zoom, I would remember to unmute myself? I would say come for hope. And I say that because in my own journey in this work, right? I'm intimately aware of the places where I struggle, where I have been hurt, where I have been harmed. What's harder sometimes to hold on to latch onto, are the places where I am strong, where I am resilient, where my people are resilient, where my community is resilient. And my encouragement would be, come to be reminded of those places, to become intimately familiar with them, so that you can learn to call them out in other people.
Yeah. I was watching the program I shared with you guys earlier, and the character's wife died of Alzheimer's. And he was engaging another character in the story, just reflecting on the death of his wife from Alzheimer's and talking about the most gruesome part of it was that she didn't know who he was as her husband. And he made this statement that I think we want to disrupt, we want to change. And the character said this: I've spent so much time wishing for the past that I've screwed up my present and probably even my future. I really believe this idea of hope and anchor is the idea that we want you to engage your past so you don't screw up your present and definitely not your future. The idea is for you to realize that there's growth from this trauma, no matter how horrific it is, in the development of someone that can be redemptive, not only just for themselves, but for the people around them. And that's our hope, that there will be a lot of redemption in this experience. We really wish you would take this upon us. I want to make one last statement of why this engagement with the Allender Center was so important. Before the pandemic, and that's when we started this relationship, it was pretty evident to me that majority of the people who engage in mental health don't look like the people in this panel. And they're not always of means. The idea of engaging trauma seems to be something for people who are crazy or are screwed up, or they can't afford it. I don't have money to address this. And therefore, many of the times, the people who don't get the relief, don't get the care, are people of color. And what we want to do is let this be the first on-ramp to contributing to the well-being of all people, Asian, Native, Black, Latino, and white. And so we really hope that you would engage this. This is our attempt to contribute to this. The field is wide and open for mental health care in the United States of America, because so many are not doing it. I mean, if we even pay attention to our mass shootings, how often is mass shootings attached to mental health issues? So this is our attempt to contribute to the well-being, not just of the Impact movement, but for the broader communities that we're in touch with as well. Because our well-being is at risk when you don't have well-being. So having said that, we thank you for tonight. Maybe we need to come up with a better cadence and come back with more Facebook Lives. I want to thank our panel, Michael, Rebecca, TJ, and Renee. They're brilliant people. And if you come to that weekend, you'll see how brilliant they really are. But you know what? Along with that brilliance are people who really care about you, and they will be present to be with you during that time. So I want to say thank you to all of you and all the work you've done with Hope and Anchor. Thank you for our audience who joined us tonight and those who will view us through the recording. May the Lord bless you and keep you until we meet again. Thank you.